everyone, my name is Amelia, welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to another reading wrap-up. We are at the end of June now, and can I just say, the summer, at least for me, it feels like it's been like flying by. Like, I finished school at the end of April, and now it's already like July. That seems crazy. Regardless, June was a pretty good reading month for me. I read 8 books, 7 like fiction, physical books, and then also an audiobook, a non-fiction audiobook that is. And the first book that I read this month was Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I mean, what can I say about this book that hasn't already been said? Obviously, it is a beautifully written book, a masterpiece, if you will. Tolkien's writing is very beautiful. His prose strikes a really nice balance, at least for me, between being like descriptive and flowery, but also like not going too over the top. I know some people think that he describes trees too much, but it's kind of part of the style and like the world building. He creates such a rich world with, well, one with the history of the world, but also with just like the descriptions of the world. I think his descriptions of the world are what make it feel so alive to so many people. Like, he uses a lot of like anthropomorphism in his writing about the world. He'll say like, the mountain has knees, or the stream was joyful, and it makes the world feel so much more like alive around the characters. And I really feel like every time I reread Lord of the Rings that I get a little bit more out of it. And this time I was definitely really trying to pay more attention to his prose and his word choice. Because as I mentioned before in this channel, I would like to write a book, and I don't think I would specifically go for exactly like that kind of prose style, but it is a good way to at least like learn something, you know? And I have to say that it was definitely a faster reading experience than I remember it being. Like, people act like it's a really hard thing to read, Lord of the Rings, but it's really not. And especially if you skip like the poems and the songs. I mean, I read them this time, but I have in the past just skipped over them, and you don't miss too much by skipping them. Like, you miss more of like his deeper world building and that kind of stuff, but like you won't miss anything that like makes the plot of Lord of the Rings like something you couldn't understand. And yeah, I will hopefully have time to read Two Towers in July, and I'm really looking forward to that. All right, next up, I read The Storm Before the Storm, and this is the non-fiction audiobook that I listened to, and I really enjoyed it. I really like when audiobooks, like at least especially the non-fiction ones, are narrated by the author, because I feel like you can hear in their voice that they really care about the subject matter and they're really familiar with it. So this book is about the Roman Republic. It very briefly covers like the beginning stuff, but then it mostly focuses on like the middle and then towards the end, because the subject matter is talking about all the events that directly or indirectly led to the end of the Republic and the beginning of like the Empire with like the Caesars and whatnot. And he managed to really make the people who are involved in all this stuff really feel like characters in a book. Like, they're so like alive, and they make mistakes and obviously all that stuff that actual like real people do, because they were real people, but the way he managed to present them made them feel a lot more, I don't know how to describe it, but just like, yeah, more like characters. Like, they're very interesting, they do crazy stuff. But that was just, I guess, the Romans. I mean, what I really took away from this book is that Romans really loved throwing people in the Tiber, but the information was presented in a really interesting and informative way. So if you have any interest at all in Rome, then I really recommend that you give this book a listen. It was very well done. All right, after that I read The Councillor, and I only gave this 2.5 out of 5 stars. It's supposed to be like a political intrigue sort of fantasy thing, and it follows this woman who used to work for the queen, and then the queen dies, and this woman is tasked with choosing a new monarch from within the other cities in the realm. However, an old enemy is returning, and she really wants to use her time in power to help the people, because she was a commoner too, and especially the magic users in the world, which are like prosecuted and they often executed. And initially I was enjoying it. I liked the beginning and like the setup and the initial like politics and stuff. However, it kind of started to go downhill pretty quickly for me. The Councillor, who is like the woman who's choosing the new monarch, has this weird sexual fixation about choking one of the other rulers. And like, look, people can do whatever they want as long as they're two consenting adults, but like, I thought I was signing up to read a political fantasy book, and so this like constantly bringing this thing up, I was like, I don't really see how this is relevant to the plot. This is just distracting. It takes me out of the story, and yeah, it really kind of ruined the reading experience for me. And then towards the end, there was this twist that it just felt so predictable, like, and typical. I'm like, I don't want to like shit on YA, but like it felt kind of like a YA twist. Like it started out as like, okay, this is gonna be this adult political fantasy, and then it was like, meh, you know? So unfortunately I was a little bit disappointed in it, and I also thought it was a standalone, but apparently it was not. So honestly, I think this book would have been better without this old enemy returning thing. Like, just make it a standalone, following all the like political things that go on as this woman tries to elect a new ruler, and she can even care about like the commoners and the magic people, but like, I don't know, it wasn't what I wanted it to be. Alright, next up I read Rage of Dragons by Evan Winters, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. I did quite enjoy it. It follows our main character, Tao, who is part of this civilization of people who lost their last home, and so they came to this new land and they took it by force, and they've essentially been at war with the original inhabitants ever since, and they're still using their dragons to help them in this war, but we get some hints that the dragons might have been part of the reason they had to leave their last home in the first place, so they could be bringing the same doom down on them here. Anyway, Tao has been training like his whole life to be part of like the elite division of the lower class military. They have like a mandatory military service, so his dad wants him to be in like the elite division and not like the shitty kind of, you know, cannon fodder division. But as the testing for the army gets closer, there is an incident, and Tao spends essentially the rest of the book, and I assume the series, by the way it's all set up, in pursuit of revenge. A lot of the things that happen in this book are hinging around the class system, which I think was interesting because not only are the nobles like having more power politically, but they're also like physically bigger and stronger, so it makes it even more difficult for the lower class people to do any sort of uprising because they are just so much physically weaker than the nobles. And then I also really enjoyed the magic system. You get all the power from like this separate dimension, and anybody can technically go there, but only if you're gifted can you really draw power from it, because while anybody else could draw power, the only way to stop the demons that live in this realm from finding you is to shroud yourself, and only the gifted people are able to do this. So there's a limited number of people who can use magic. Also, you can only die in this realm if you do draw magic, but if you go there and you don't draw magic, you will still be ripped apart by the demons, and even though when you come back into the normal dimension, you won't be physically harmed, you'll still have felt the pain of being killed by the demons in this other world. So a lot of people kind of lose it a little bit after this, get PTSD or whatever. They don't really call it that, but that's essentially what it is. And I liked how this book kind of makes you think a little bit, because like you're obviously supposed to root for like the people whose perspective you're from, like our main characters and stuff, but you're also kind of like, well, these other people were already here, so you're just invaders or colonists, if you will, so you kind of don't want to root for them, but they're being presented to you as the good guys. So it'll be interesting to see if Winters does anything with this. I kind of feel like, based on like some little bits that we've got, that he is going to. Hopefully he will, because otherwise, I don't know, it would just kind of be like, okay, well, these people kind of did just take everything from these other people, so I don't really know how I'm supposed to root for them, but we shall see. And then I would have to say that my main sort of critique, which may be more of like a personal preference thing, is that I find the trope of having like the main character who's like solely motivated by revenge to be a little bit boring. I just find that it tends to make the main character very like single faceted. Like if they're super hyper focused on revenge, then you get less of like a personality from them. Like, and especially in like Tao, in this whole book, he's just like, I gotta get better and better and better so that I can get revenge, and he devotes himself with like a single-minded focus to this, which makes sense for like his circumstances. But if it was 3 books of this, I'm not actually sure how many books are in this series, I don't think that would be very interesting. So I'm hoping that Winters expands on Tao's characters and we'll get some other motivations and things going on. But yeah, I think if we expand on Tao a little bit and explore the little colonization flaw in these people, there could be a really good series, and I'm excited to check out the next one. Alright, next up is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, and I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. So I decided to pick this up because I read the Broken Earth trilogy and I didn't really love it, but I know that a lot of people really love N.K. Jemisin's work, so I wanted to give her another shot. I did enjoy this book for the most part. I like how different it is. It's got a very unique concept where cities can come alive once they've like accumulated enough of like a unique culture. And we're in New York just as New York is waking up, but there's a little bit of a problem. There's like this interdimensional enemy that tries to kill cities as they're being born, and New York's main avatar, I guess, sort of fights him off, and he seems like he's defeated him, but he hasn't yet. And part of the problem is that instead of there just being one main avatar, or like a person who kind of becomes the city, there's also one for each borough as well as the primary avatar, and I guess that kind of splits up the power of the city a little bit. So they have to try to come back together to defeat this interdimensional evil who likes to eat cities. So throughout the story, we follow the avatars of each borough as they figure out who they've just become, try to find each other, and also fight off this enemy, while ultimately looking for the primary avatar so that they can get him to help them defend the city. And Jemisin uses this kind of setup to make a lot of commentary on race and class, specifically as it pertains to New York and the different boroughs. And I really feel like I learned a lot about like New York's demographics and the general vibe of each borough. Each avatar was meant to sort of represent the general character of a borough, and I felt that they were really interesting and well written and each like a distinct personality. But unfortunately, I just don't really jive with Jemisin's writing. It's very kind of like, I don't know, modern, I guess, maybe, but in a way that doesn't really work for me. Like, she'll use a lot of like sounds and really like casual language, but I don't know if casual is the right word. I don't know, it's just like the way that she writes just, yeah, isn't really my favorite for me, and I probably won't read any more N.K. Jemisin just because they're never the best experience for me. Like, she has interesting stories, I just don't like her writing. After that, I read Black Sun, and I decided to give this book 5 stars. It's my first one in a while, other than Fellowship, but that's a reread. So Black Sun was an extremely well done fantasy series. We follow a boy who is the vessel for a god to touch Earth. We follow a teak woman who has been exiled by her people, and finally a woman who has risen above her birth to become the sun priest, which is like the head of the religion. And instead of drawing on like the typical sort of medieval Europe stuff that a lot of fantasy is kind of built on, Roanhorse's world is inspired by Native American cultures. So the world feels very like new and refreshing and unique, and I really enjoyed it. The story in this book is kind of a combination of political intrigue, we got personal turmoil, and we got like the battles of the gods, and each of our kind of main characters sort of represents one of these themes. So first up, we have the sun priest, who has risen from what is essentially like the slum district of her world to become the sun priest, which is kind of like the most powerful person in the religion, and to some extent in like the city or like the world. But her position has lost a lot of its power. Her predecessor sort of allowed other people to take the reins on a whole bunch of different things. So she's kind of trying to get that power back so that she can make sure the church remains relevant. And she's also trying to mend relationships with the Crow clan, who they unfairly punished in the past by murdering a whole bunch of people. And then we have our teak woman, and the teak are like a separate sort of race who have a lot of powers related to the ocean that they use through something called their song. And this woman, Xiala, has been exiled, and we don't really know why, and she actively avoids thinking about it as much as she can. And she's a ship's captain, and she's been hired to cross the ocean in the winter, which is a thing that's like not done because of the storms and stuff. But she's been hired to bring our final character, the Crow priest guy, across the ocean to a city in time for the eclipse. And as they are crossing, she really begins to discover more about herself and her powers, and begins to sort of question her way forward in life. And then I would say that my favorite character was our Crow boy. He's been signed up to be this vessel for the gods by his mother before he was even born, before he was even conceived. He did not sign up for this. Now his body is not only his, and he's had this mission drilled into him by his mother and his tutors, but as he goes off with Xiala to cross the sea, he begins to think about what he might actually want from life if he actually like had a choice, was able to choose for himself. And it all comes together in this really well-crafted finale that really sets us up perfectly for the next book. Overall, I felt that Rowan Horse's writing and character work was really well done, and that the world building was very refreshing. After Black Sun, I immediately picked up the sequel, Fevered Star, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. And it was a little bit weaker than the first book. It kind of suffers a little bit from like middle book syndrome, where we're kind of spending most of the book setting things up for what will be like the final showdown in presumably the next book. I think it's just a trilogy. But each of our characters is given a chance to develop, learn more about themselves, and by the end of the book they're all like set upon their path for the next book. There's one scene specifically in this book that I felt was kind of weak, which is where Xiala, our teak woman, finally decides to confront the trauma from her past. But instead of there being like this inciting incident that brings her to confront her past, it's just kind of like, oh, she's having a few like problems with her powers, so she's just like, it must just be because I'm traumatized, even though this trauma she's been carrying with her this whole time and it's never had an effect on her powers before. And she's essentially just like, well, I gotta think about it, and then maybe my powers will come back. So she just sits down and thinks about it. And it just felt very kind of like abrupt and unnatural to me. I think it would have been better if maybe she makes that connection, but she continues to fight against it because the memory is so hard for her to deal with that she continues to fight against it until like her back's against a wall. She has to get to her powers, and this is kind of like a last ditch effort. I don't know, I feel like that scene needed a little bit more workshopping. It felt kind of rough, I guess. But overall, the book was a little bit weaker than the first one, but I'm still looking forward to the next book, and it was still an enjoyable read. Finally, I read The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington, and I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. So in Shadow of What Was Lost, we follow our main character, Davian. Davian is a magic user, and as such, he goes to the magic user school, and he's bound by what is called the Tenants. So essentially, previously, there was this big old war against the magic users who used to be the rulers, and they lost, and so the other side forced them to be bound by what is called the Tenants, which are like magically enforced laws about how they can use their powers. So our inciting incident is that Davian is supposed to be a magic user. He's got this like tattoo that only appears if you've used a certain amount of magic, so he's gotta be a magic user, but he's unable to use it, and these tests are coming up where you have to demonstrate your abilities with the magic, and if you fail, then you become what's called a shadow, and you have your ability to use power removed from you, and you're kind of like the lowest echelon of society. So as these tests are coming up and these elder magic users come to like observe these tests, one of them kind of pulls Davian aside, or comes to him at night, I can't remember, and tells him that he's actually a different kind of magic user, one that's even more hated. And so he tells him he has to run away, and he sends him on this quest with this cube that's supposed to like guide him to wherever he's got to go, and he'll be able to learn more about his powers and stuff if he manages to get there. Of course, as he escapes, the scope of the book starts to expand, and their ancient enemy is like breaking through this boundary. And so for me, the first half of this book was kind of weak, and even to an extent the whole thing had some issues. I think really my main problem was just a lot of unoriginality. Like, I know all fantasy is derivative to some extent, inspired by other fantasy, fairy tales, folk tales, that kind of dealio, but there were just some things in this book that I just felt were too similar to other things for comfort. So for example, as they're like trying to get back to this other country, they're running away, and they know there's like some evil things kind of stalking them, they gotta go through this city. And the city is like abandoned, there's this unknown sort of like horror lurking there, and as they're like close to the city, the evil things kind of come up and they flee into the city, and the evil things will not follow them into the city. Does this sound familiar? It should, because it's just Shatter Lagoth from Wheel of Time. And even just like the boundary, like it's kind of just like the Blight from Wheel of Time a little bit. But other than that, the magic system to me felt a little bit like a mess. The augurs, which is like the type of magic user that Davian is, have all of these like random powers that they are able to stem from this one magic source, but they're just like, they can like slow time and be invisible and read minds and control people's minds and all this stuff, and it's just the way they're described as like individual like talents makes them feel like different things, and then I'm just like, okay, what's going on in this magic system. And they have all of these powers, and yet somehow they were defeated in like the last war. And how they kind of get away with doing that when they can like foresee the future is they're like, their like abilities stopped working. They couldn't see the future correctly anymore, and that's like why people revolted. But it's like, even without the ability to see the future, if you can like control people and read people's minds, I feel like that gives you a pretty big advantage. And like, yeah, maybe they had less numbers, but it supposedly was just kind of like one swoop and they like took them all out. It's like, I think it should have been harder than that. But anyway, that's not really what happens in this story, so I'll let it slide. Oh, and of course David is somehow kind of like a little bit of like a chosen one, because we wouldn't want to miss out on that trope. The second half picked up quite a bit and became a lot more interesting and unique. We got some more POVs from the other characters, and we got the increased conflict as the enemy invaders get close to the city. And overall, I did enjoy it. It's definitely not a masterpiece by any means, but if you don't mind fantasy that's like a little bit derivative, you might still enjoy this. And I think I am going to pick up the second book at some point, but I'm not like in a rush to, you know? But that is everything that I read in June. I would say it was a pretty good reading month for me. Some really good books, some not as good, but that is the nature of reading. You don't know if you're gonna like a book until you do read it. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.